When you hear of the Wild West, what comes to mind? Cowboys roaming the range and gunslingers ruling the dusty streets. But forget what you thought you knew about the Old West. We're about to explore the wildest, weirdest, and downright strange events that ever occurred in those frontier towns. So join us as we explore the top 15 unusual things that took place in the Wild West. Number 1. One man, two graves. This is the story of the one and only Jesse James. This fellow was so notorious that his old enemies couldn't forget him. Even after he retired from his bank-robbing days and settled in Kearney, Missouri. After Jesse was tragically murdered, his family buried him in his front yard to stop pesky grave robbers from getting their hands on him. But as time passed and his enemies started dying, his family decided to give the poor fella a proper burial in a Kearney cemetery. But here's where things get really interesting. In Granbury, Texas, there's a grave with Jesse James's name on it, and people have been wondering who the heck is buried there. Well, let me tell you, it's none other than a man named J. Frank Dalton, popped up in 1948 at the ripe old age of 101, claiming he was the real Jesse James. And to get this, the court even let him adopt the bandit's name legally. Can you believe that? Nobody knows why Dalton made such a bold claim, or if he had any link to Jesse James, but it sure is a story to tell. However, DNA tests proved that the real Jesse James is buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney. But let's be honest, Jesse James was larger than life, so much so that his body required two graves. Number 2. Gettysburg of the West. Confederate General Henry Hopkins Sibley once had a bright idea. He wanted to relieve the pressure on the Confederate armies in the East and weaken Northern political solidarity. However, he had a worthy opponent in General Samuel Curtis of the Union. Price had started his invasion of Missouri in September of 1864, intending to force the Union to send more troops to the Western Theater. Price's raids at Pilot Knob and Jefferson City were repulsed by strong Union resistance, so he hatched a plan to invade New Mexico territory and march up to Colorado. But little did Sibley know that the 1st Regiment of Volunteers in Colorado was onto him. Those Yankees got wind of the scheme and marched 400 miles south in 13 days to join forces with the Union troops at Fort Union near Santa Fe. It wasn't going to be the easy ride Sibley had planned. The Union troops, probably relying on local ranchers and guides, outflanked the Confederates and burned their supply train after 2 days of skirmishing. It was a classic case of underestimating your opponent. Sibley's forces fought what many historians call the Gettysburg of the West. The Union troops formed a defensive line at the Blue River on October 21, 1864, to stop Price's westward march toward Leavenworth. But on October 22nd, Price's army of 9,000 crossed the Blue River at Byram's Ford, near present-day Swope Park, forcing the Union garrison to retreat. Curtis set up a new defensive line along the south side of Brush Creek, just south of Westport, but Price wasn't deterred. He pushed Curtis's troops north across Brush Creek to the present-day Country Club Plaza. The brief Confederate advance ended as the Union Cavalry Division led by General Alfred Pleasanton arrived from the east, bringing the Union forces to more than 20,000 soldiers. The Battle of Westport culminated the next day, and it was a bloody affair. Each side lost about 1,500 soldiers, which took a more significant toll on the smaller Confederate army. Pleasanton's pursuing cavalry overtook Price's army at Mine Creek in Lynn County, Kansas, on October 25th. In one of the largest mounted cavalry battles of the war, the Confederates lost another 1,200 soldiers who were injured, captured, or killed. Price's beaten army of about 6,000 had to face the harsh truth that they were outmatched and outsmarted. After that, they had to retreat to Texas, tails between their legs. They never returned, and that was the end of that. Number 3. Bison Express. When the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 was signed, the railroad moneyman George Francis Train, who thought he had it all figured out, was so excited that he proclaimed that the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 was the grandest enterprise under God, and that 10 million people would settle in the Golden Land within 20 years. He was right about the settlement, but he couldn't have imagined the disastrous impact the Transcontinental Railroad would have on the American West. Let's rewind a bit. In the mid-19th century, an estimated 30 million to 60 million buffalo roamed the plains. They were massive, majestic creatures who rumbled by the hundreds of thousands, earning them the nickname Thunder of the Plains. Native Americans hunted them, but they did so responsibly, ensuring they didn't overhunt. Even William Buffalo Bill Cody, who was hired to hunt them to feed rail laborers, couldn't make much of a dent in their population. But then the Transcontinental Railroad came along, making it easier for hunters to get to the west. Hunters from the east arrived by train, packing .50 caliber rifles and killing buffalo for sport, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Unlike the Native Americans who hunted for food and shelter, the hunters from the east killed for fun. The railroads even advertised hunting by rail excursions, where passengers could take aim at buffalo from the train. As a result, the buffalo population dwindled rapidly. The hunters killed hundreds of thousands of buffalo in just a few years, causing Native Americans to lose their primary food source and way of life. In fact, one hunter, Orlando Brown, brought down nearly 6,000 buffalo by himself and lost hearing in one ear from the constant firing of his .50 caliber rifle. One colonel even told a wealthy hunter, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." This mentality led to the species' near extinction, and Native Americans were pushed into reservations. The buffalo's decline signaled the end of the Indian Wars. By the end of the 19th century, only 300 buffalo were left in the wild. Congress finally took action, outlawing the killing of any birds or animals in Yellowstone National Park, where the only surviving buffalo herd could be protected. Conservationists established more wildlife preserves, and the species slowly rebounded. Today, there are more than 200,000 bison in North America. Number 4. Terrible whiskey. Imagine after a long day, you walk into a dusty saloon in the wild, wild west, feeling like a cowboy on top of the world. You saddle up on a bar stool, order the bartender's finest whiskey, and take a swig, only to immediately regret your decision. This stuff tastes like gasoline, and yet, the bottle boasts that it's been aged for a decade and hails all the way from Kentucky. Crazy, right? Back in those days, copyright laws were non-existent, and since you're on the frontier, nobody was around to care anyways. Many of the whiskey sold might have been cut with water or other spirits to increase profits, and some of those so-called bourbons, they were distilled from low-grade molasses, according to Serious Eats. Yikes. The names famous for whiskey in that era were bizarre, too. You had Coffin Varnish, which isn't exactly a confidence booster, and then there's the Mountain Howitzer, which sounds like something you'd shoot out of a cannon. But it even gets strange. There's Tangle Leg because this booze was so strong that your legs would get all tangled up while trying to leave the bar. Now that's what you'd call a stiff drink. Number 5. Quick Draw Gunfight. So there was this famous gunslinger named Wild Bill Hickok in the Wild Wild West, and one day he got into a bit of a pickle with a fella named Davis Tutt. They had a money dispute over gambling winnings. Tutt was underwriting other gamblers to clean Hickok and run him out of town, but old Bill wasn't having any of that. He won the game fair and square, but then Tutt demanded $40 from him over some previous deal about a horse. Talk about a sore loser. According to Tom Clavin's book, Wild Bill, the true story of the American frontier's first gunfighter, Hickok gave Tutt the $40 right then and there, but that wasn't enough for Tutt. He then demanded another $25. When Hickok refused, Tutt got real cheeky and snatched Hickok's pocket watch right off the table. The next day, Tutt was strutting around town, showing off that watch like it was his personal trophy. Hickok tried to reason with the man, but Tutt wouldn't listen. And so, just before 6 p.m., on July 21st, 1865, in Springfield, Missouri, the two men faced off in what would become the first recorded quick-draw fight in history. Hickok warned Tutt not to cross the square with that stolen watch, but Tutt went for his gun anyway, and so did Hickok. The two paused momentarily, locked eyes, and then drew their weapons. Ultimately, Hickok emerged victorious, sending a bullet straight through Tutt's heart. Word of the fight spread like wildfire. 2 years later, an illustration of the showdown was featured in Harper's new monthly magazine. Number 6. The Gold Rush. Y'all might think the California Gold Rush of 1849 was the be-all and end-all of gold rushes, but know this, it wasn't even the first or second time America had gone gold crazy. It all started in 1799 in Cabarrus County, North Carolina. One day, a young boy named Conrad Reed stumbled upon a big yellow rock in his dad's field. They didn't know what it was at first. They probably thought it was just a big piece of fancy gravel or something. So they used it as a doorstop for a few years until a fancy jeweler came to town and recognized it for what it was, a 17-pound gold nugget. Now you can imagine what happened next. People started digging, panning, and searching high and low for more sweet gold. Congress even had to build the Charlotte Mint to keep up with all the gold being pulled out of the ground in North Carolina. Then, in 1828, gold was discovered in Georgia, and the nation was hit with its second gold rush. But it wasn't until 1848 that old James Marshall struck it rich at Sutter's Mill in California, and the real party started. Thousands of famous 49ers flocked to California from all over the world to try and make their fortune. And so, the California Gold Rush of 1849 may have been the most famous, but it wasn't the first or the last time Americans went gold crazy. Number 7. The OK Corral Shootout. Listen up, folks, because I'm about to take you back to the wild, wild West, where men were men, guns were legal, and shootouts were the norm. We're talking about the legendary shootout between the Earp brothers, Doc Holliday, Billy Claiborne, Clanton, and McClory brothers. This gunfight must have been an epic battle of the ages with 8 men involved. But nope, it only lasted 30 seconds. That's barely enough time for a decent TikTok video, let alone a full-blown shootout. And the whole thing went down in a spot that wasn't even the OK Corral. It happened behind the corral, near 3rd Street and Fremont Street in Tombstone, Arizona. Despite the briefness of the shootout, there was still plenty of bloodshed to go around. 3 of the law enforcement officers were injured, and 3 of the cowboys ended up dead. But who shot first, you ask? Well, that's a mystery. We all know that Virgil shot Clanton, Doc Holliday blasted Tom with a shotgun, and Wyatt took out Frank with a gut shot. And after all that, Clanton and Claiborne ran away, tail between their legs, unscathed. So you see, it wasn't much of a shootout after all. Well, of course, things didn't end there. The Earps and Holliday were actually put on trial for murder. The whole thing turned into a fiasco with people siding with the cowboys, the Earps, and Holliday. Ultimately, the judge ruled in favor of the Earps and Holliday, and they walked away as free as a bird. Number 8. Dead outlaws posing for photographs. For some people, this might be gruesome, but that was how it was when outlaws ruled the Wild West, and the local newspapers were full of juicy stories about their exploits. Of course, as with all good stories, there was a bit of exaggeration involved after. Those books and papers loved to embellish the truth to make things even more exciting. But the townspeople wanted proof when those outlaws met their untimely end in a blaze of glory. The authorities wanted to send a message to any other would-be lawbreakers, and that's where photography came in. The invention of photography during the 19th century was a real game-changer. Now there was a way to get a final snapshot of those dead outlaws before they were buried 6 feet under. Sometimes the whole gang would be pushed together for one last photo op, and other times it would just be a duo propped up together like a couple of lifeless dolls. Morbid? Maybe. But it made for memorable pictures that satisfied the townspeople's curiosity and helped the authorities deliver a clear message. Look at these dead outlaws, they seem to say. This is what happens when you mess with us. So, if you were thinking about breaking the law in this town, think twice. Number 9. Feral camels roaming the plains of Texas. In 1855, Jefferson Davis, then the Secretary of War, convinced Congress to spend $30,000 importing camels and dromedaries for military purposes. Davis thought the animals would be useful for transporting supplies to remote outposts in the West, since the Transcontinental Railroad was still years away. So, the U.S. Army went on a shopping spree and purchased 75 camels from the Mediterranean and Middle East. The camels were initially stationed at Camp Verde in Texas, where they were used to haul supplies to San Antonio. Some were put to work in Texas, where they were used for small pack trains to El Paso and Fort Bowie. In 1860, 2 expeditions were sent to search for undiscovered routes along the Mexican border. Unfortunately, Congress rejected proposals to purchase more camels because the mule lobby didn't want competition from the exotic animals. Eventually, the Civil War broke out. Texas seceded from the Union, leading to Confederate forces taking over Camp Verde and its camels. The camels were then let loose to graze, and some even wandered away. Union forces managed to capture 3 of them, then sold them at an auction in Iowa in 1863. Others were used by the Confederate Post Office Department, while some found their way into Mexico. Number 10. Crashing trains. In the 1890s, Texans had difficulty finding something to do for fun. Sure, there were farmers' groups for guys to hang out and chat about business. Ladies had the Christian Temperance Union, but that was about it. That's when a railway agent named William Crush had a wild idea. Crash 2 trains together for public entertainment. Somehow, Crush convinced the higher-ups at Katy to follow his plan. He hurried around the state, preparing for the big day with a team of workers. On September 15th, the day of the event, Thousands of people traveled by train to Crush's temporary town called the City of Crush, paying $2 to get in. By 10 a.m., there were already 10,000 people there, and the crowds kept rolling in every 5 minutes. Lawyers, doctors, farmers, artisans, clerks, and people from all walks of life were there, ready to see something extraordinary. The event was so popular that the actual collision had to be delayed because trains were still arriving at the scheduled 4 p.m. showtime. In total, 40,000 people showed up, making Crush the second largest city in Texas for a hot minute. At 5:10 p.m., Crush rode in on a white horse, waving his hat and signaling for the trains to start. The engineers and conductors on board each engine got things moving and then jumped to safety about 30 yards from the starting point. As the two engines approached each other, they reached speeds of 50 miles per hour, dragging a row of empty boxcars behind them. The collision was as epic as everyone hoped, but it quickly turned dangerous according to one reporter on the scene. There was just a swift instant of silence. Then, as if controlled by a single impulse, both boilers exploded simultaneously. The air was filled with flying missiles of iron and steel, varying in size from a postage stamp to half a driving wheel, falling indiscriminately on the just and unjust, the rich and the poor, the great and the small. At least 2 people died, and many others were injured by the flying debris and scalding water that erupted from the boilers. The photographer hired to take official photos of the crash, J.C. Dean, even lost an eye to a steel bolt. It was chaos. Even one Confederate veteran said it was scarier than Pickett's last charge at Gettysburg. Despite all that, people still rushed forward to claim souvenirs from the wreckage. Crush got fired right after the incident, but was rehired when Katie realized how much publicity the stunt had generated. They paid Dean $10,000 and gave him a lifetime railroad pass, and they dealt with other claims as quickly as possible. Even with the disaster, the event was a huge success, with international press coverage and Katie becoming an overnight sensation. Talk about making the best of a situation. Number 11. Armed bank robbery. Believe it or not, the Wild West wasn't the birthplace of bank robberies. The first one went down in 1831, 30 years before the Wild West era, and the robbers didn't even use guns. They just waltzed in with a set of forged keys and helped themselves. But, as with all things, progress marches on. The first non-war-related bank robbery occurred in 1863 in Malden, Massachusetts. It all went down at noon when a fellow named Edward Green, Malden's 32-year-old postmaster, strolled into the Malden Bank for some change. Green was a bit lush and had a sizable debt weighing him down, but when he strolled into that bank on December 15, 1863, he saw a chance to fix all his problems. Unfortunately for him, only one person was working at the time, a 17-year-old kid who just happened to be the bank president's son. Green left empty-handed, but he wasn't done yet. He stumbled back home, grabbed his trusty firearm, and shot the kid point-blank in the head. With his grisly deed done, Green made off with $5,000 in cash. That might not sound like a lot today, but in 1863, that was over $105,000. Of course, his sudden financial windfall didn't go unnoticed. Folks started to get suspicious when the once-in-debt postmaster suddenly had money to burn. Well, Green confessed to the whole thing just a month later. But wait, there's more. Green's crime wasn't just any old bank robbery. Oh no, he had to go and make history. He was the first man hanged for an armed bank robbery in America. Number 12. Train robbery. Well, banks were not the only places robbed in the Wild West. Trains were also robbed. The Reno gang was ahead when they pulled off the first heist on a moving train in 1866. The gang was after money, jewelry, and other valuables. They found themselves on a train and forced the messenger to open one of the safes, and they pocketed $18,000 worth of cash and other goodies. But, you know what they say, go big or go home. The Reno gang wanted to crack open the big safe, but there was just one problem. They needed the key. So, in a moment of genius, they kicked the safe off the train, hoping to come back for it later. Unfortunately, it was too heavy, and they had to leave it behind. A couple years later, the law caught up with the Reno gang, and 6 members were hanged on a tree at a spot now known as Hangman Crossing. They were buried in Seymour, Indiana, and if you're ever in the area, you can visit their graves behind a little gate. Number 13. Failed robbery. While the Reno gang pulled off an out-of-this-world robbery, Elmer McCurdy wasn't so lucky. In 1911, Elmer McCurdy had a not-so-brilliant idea to rob a passenger train he thought was carrying gold. Turns out, he wasn't great at picking his targets, because he only managed to get away with a measly $46. To make things worse, law enforcement officers shot McCurdy shortly after the heist. His corpse was then embalmed with an arsenic preparation and sold to a traveling carnival as a sideshow curiosity. And you won't believe what happened next. For the next 60 years, McCurdy's body was bought and sold like a used car, passed around from haunted house to wax museums as a creepy prop or attraction. But here's the kicker. In 1976, while filming The $6 Million Man at an amusement park in Long Beach, California, one of the prop's fingers, or was it an arm, broke off and revealed something shocking: a human tissue. The prop was actually Elmer McCurdy's body all along. After some testing by the Los Angeles coroner's office, McCurdy's body was finally buried at Boot Hill Cemetery in Dodge City, Kansas, where he rests in peace 66 years after his death. Number 14. Cowboys didn't wear 10-gallon hats. Back then, everyone was rocking the flat-brimmed Stetson called the Boss of the Plains. Forget about those oversized 10-gallon hats you see in the movies. Those weren't a thing until the 1920s, when Hollywood started glorifying cowboys. The Boss was the hat of choice for cowboys, ranchers, farmers, and anyone who spent time outdoors, and for a good reason. The hat was lightweight, waterproof, and durable. Plus, the inside was insulated enough to use as a water bucket for your trusty steed. The wide brim kept the sun out of your eyes and protected your neck from getting fried. The creator of the Stetson, John Stetson, noticed that the hats people wore on the plains needed to be cutting it. Straw, silk, fur, and wool hats were either too hot in the summer or soggy in the rain. So, he devised the perfect solution: the Boss of the Plains. These hats retailed for $4.50 back in the day, which might not seem like much, but that's about $74 in today's money. And they were made with nutria fur, which is some fancy stuff. Number 15. Famous gunmen perform for shows. Back in the day, residents of New York City got to witness one of the wildest stage shows ever. Buffalo Bill Cody and Wild Bill Hickok swapping tall tales around a blazing campfire. And no, this wasn't just some ordinary theater production. This was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, featuring all sorts of wild and crazy performances. They had staged buffalo hunts where brave cowboys would chase down these massive beasts on horseback, shooting their rifles and showing off their skills. And then there were the reenactments of famous events like stagecoach robberies, where audiences would hold their breath as the robbers made their move. But let's remember the main attraction: Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok themselves. These legendary figures of the Wild West would regale the crowd with their tales of adventure and daring, all while sitting around a cozy campfire. It was like being transported straight to the prairies of Kansas. The height of it was probably the parade he held in 1902. It was a sight to behold, with cowboys, Native Americans, and other animals parading down the street for all to see. In fact, you can still see the video footage of that parade at the Library of Congress. So there you have our top 15 unusual events in the Wild Wild West. Which of these would you have loved to witness? Share your thoughts in the comments section.